Today we ask that always important question, what's in a name? So here we're in Midrash Rabbah of Esther, and it's 6:2, someplace in the middle we're starting out. So I'm just going to read the Hebrew, and some say that Mordechai, um, oh no, it goes earlier. Lama nikra shmo Yehudi v'hala yaminihu. Why is Mordechai termed Yehudi, a Yehudite? Was he not a Benjamin? Wasn't he a Benjamin, like the verse at the end says? So the Midrash answers, "Lefi yichad shmo shel Kodesh Baruch Hu k'neged kol bai olam," because he demonstrated the uniqueness of the name of the Holy One, blessed is He, before all of the inhabitants of the world. So before we even move on, it doesn't sound like it's talking about Mordechai. It sounds like it's talking about Abraham, right? And then it brings a pasuk, "Lo yichrav v'lo yishtachav." Mordechai would not bow and would not prostrate himself. He's not going to bow down. This is the story of Haman. Haman comes out. He is forcing this confrontation. He wants Mordechai not only to bend down to him, he wants him to bend down to the idolatry that he represents. I kind of translated that a little bit like a Miltonist, that Haman is a form of political power, and he wants Mordechai to bend down to it. Now the Midrash asks, "V'chi kantron hayav over all gezeres hamelech." Was Mordechai? This is the translation here. Was Mordechai such a troublemaker that he should gratuitously transgress the decree of the king? Was Mordechai such a person that he would endanger himself in that way? Why does he refuse to bow? Elos, and I will find out, Ela kashet siva Achashverosh lehishtachvut lahaman chakak avodazara al libo. So when Achashverosh demanded that people bow down to Haman, he engraved avodazara al libo, and he intended such that people would bow down to him. And not only that, but to the idol over his heart. I see. Ukashahaya roa Haman she'ein Mordechai mishtachav lo nismala hema. So when Haman saw that Mordechai did not bow down to him, he was filled with wrath. Mordechai Omerlo yesh adon hamisgoy al kol geim heich oni manicho v'shtachav avodah zara. When Haman saw that Mordechai did not bow down to him, he was filled with wrath. But Mordechai said to him, "There is a master, the Adon, who exalts himself all over all who exalt it. How can I forsake him and bow down to an idol? How can I forsake him and bow down to an idol? Heich oni manicho. How would I place him aside and bow down to an idol? Lomar Yehudi Yachidi. And because Mordechai demonstrated the uniqueness of the name of the Holy One, blessed be He was called Yehudi. Yehudi means Yechidi. And we haven't had Abraham invoked yet, right? He was not been invoked here, but we see that the story it seems in some way to be parallel. That Mordechai, just like Abraham, what does he do? He unifies the name of God because he's living in a culture of idolaters, and Mordechai, just like Abraham, refuses to be part of that culture of idolatry. He will not bow down. I mean, I guess that's Abraham's message: do not bow down. Maybe I'm inflecting it because I know what's happening next. Now, of course, we'll see that the Midrash does talk about Abraham. V'yesh omrim in halachic this. Well, yesh omrim is an addition. I mean, yesh omrim, if it's said in Rishonim, in medieval commentators on the Gemara, it's usually different perspectives that are mutually exclusive. I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive here, especially since we're already thinking in the first part about Abraham. And some say that Mordechai is referred to as Yehudi in the sense of unique, blah, blah, blah. That's already perished, because he was equivalent in his time to Abraham in his generation. He was similar to him in his generation. So Abraham is called Yehudi, in the sense of being Yechidi, because he was like Abraham in his generation. Ma Avram Avinu Maser Asatz Maloso Kivshana Eish. What, just as our forefather Abraham gave himself over to be thrown by Nimrod into a fiery furnace, another midrash that Abraham is understood when he comes out of Ur Kasdim. Chazal use it as an excuse to talk about his going into the fiery furnace. We all know the midrashim. He goes in and he doesn't burn. So it's interesting here. We don't know yet in Mordechai what is just as Abraham did put himself into a fiery furnace. Well, what did Mordechai do? And just as the hechsir, vehikir, lubrios, geduloso, shelakodesh baruch Hu, and just as Abraham traveled around, making people aware of the greatness of the Holy One, chadadu ksiv es hanefesh asher asu b'charan, Abraham as a teacher made souls. Such a very important point to emphasize here. The rabbis do this in their teaching. A teacher makes souls. Reading and teaching helps to make souls. Really, really, truly, right? When you learn how to read, you make souls. And Abraham is teaching them how to read the world, right? Don't read it like an idolater. Read it in a different way. Don't read it in such a way that you think that the world can be understood in something that's physical, that the unknowable can be contained. Okay, Ma Mordechai biyamav hikiro briso geduloso shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's interesting here. I said we don't know what the equivalent yet is in this. It should be as just as Abraham went into the fiery furnace and came out and traveled around and spread God's name. So Mordechai became aware of the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be He. It's really weird here, right? That Mordechai himself becomes aware of the greatness of the Holy One. Abraham, in Midrash, it's almost always that the as so never adds up entirely. It doesn't make sense really. Not only do we not have the just as for Mordechai, the as so, the so too is not parallel. In Abraham, he goes around and he travels around the world. With Mordechai, he becomes awareness of the greatness of the Holy One. And thus it is written, and we do get a pasuk here, Chadu diksiv, v'rabi ma'ami ha'aretz Yahadim. So there's a story in the Midrash about how Mordechai was such a terrifying figure because the miracles that had been done had been so great on behalf of the Jews that people were actually coerced or felt coerced into becoming Jews, which is weird because the commentary on the Megillah in general is that the period of the Megillah was affirming what they had already received, a reaffirmation of Torah, but doing it in love, with love, on Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai. The original revelation was so overpowering that people had no choice but to believe. And here, with the miracle of Purim, the Jews gather around why it's such a joyous holiday, and kiblu mashakimu kfar. They established what they had already accepted, and that establishment is, the Gaon Vilna says it's with, and I'm quoting him because it makes sense. It's a acceptance of the revelation, this time with love. But here it's the people from foreign lands, and they follow the Jews because they're terrified. So let's go back to the pasuk again. Thus it is written, moreover, many Jews, many from among the people of the land, Amaratzim, other nations, they converted. And Mordechai demonstrated the uniqueness of the Holy One, blessed be He, and sanctified him. V'yachad shmo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'kadsha. That's what Mordechai did. V'lefichach nichra Yehudi, diksiv ish Yehudi, al tikra Yehudi ela yachidi. And therefore Mordechai is called Yehudi, as it is written, a Yehudi. Do not read it as Yehudi, rather as if it had been written Yechidi. Just made a fundamental mistake in reading, is looking at the notes. So how does it follow? How do we follow here? People convert. They do so out of fear. Abraham goes around and teaches But Mordechai causes people to worship the one God. That's the emphasis here. V'yechid shmo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'kidsho. He sanctified God's name, and because he did that, he is also compared to Abraham. The two things really go together. The two parts. Mordechai is a Yechidi because he doesn't bow down. He is also a Yechidi like Abraham because he also, in some sense, puts himself in the fiery furnace. What does he do? He doesn't bow down, I guess, to Haman. He sanctifies God's name in this way. Interestingly, he does so not through teaching, but rather through the fear that he instills. But we should probably add that the Megillah then becomes the Sefer. There's a whole question, and we'll talk about this in a coming Midrash. There's a whole question about what is the Megillah? Is it a letter? And the status that it would have as a letter is something temporal, contingent, or is it a Sefer? In any event, this thing is read. That is one of the mitzvot that Mordechai initiates, is that the Sefer, which is or the Megillah, which comes between Sefer and Igeret, between letter and Sefer, which are the words that are used by Chazal. The Megillah he institutes the reading of the Megillah, which is a new mitzvah. That's why we say, or that's why there's this interpretation that this was a reaffirmation of the revelation. Mordechai is decreeing, and this is really the first time that the rabbis decree a new mitzvah. So there's this partaking. Mordechai partakes then in a kind of divine authority in a way. And the Megillah itself, one of them is the mitzvah of the Megillah is to read it. And the rabbis ask in another place, why don't Jews say Hallel on Purim? Shouldn't they do so as a means of celebration? There are lots of reasons that are given. One of them is that the Megillah itself is a means of praise. And in sense, as a means of praise, it's a means of teaching. And the Megillah, in a way itself, is performing that activity of teaching. It itself is the letter which gets read and is the means through which the divine is praised, and also through the means through which Mordechai teaches his generation. It's still very interesting to think about the distinction between Abraham, who travels, and Rambam says that he writes books, publishes books, goes out and travels. And Mordechai here, he puts fear in the non-Jews. Something to think about.